Should we start?
We're doing it.
There you go. All right. I'm Mariah Mills, service designer, and I'm here with Arjun today.
Hey, I'm Arjun, also a service designer at Harmonic Design with Mariah. We're a service design consultancy based out of Atlanta.
Yep, and we are here today to talk with our friend and colleague, Shawn Harris, who is a professor at Georgia Tech and also someone that we know from our days at Georgia Tech when we were all involved with the student group called Design Bloc. So Shawn, first, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Design Bloc is and what Design Bloc is doing these days?
Sure. So Design Bloc exists on Georgia Tech's campus not only as a design center, a place to engage academics, but also the larger community around Atlanta. One of our main offerings, or the biggest offering that we're known for, is all of our different classes on campus. What we really try to focus on in being designers is being able to teach and engage the inside community of Georgia Tech's campus. How do we instill these problem-solving techniques, these non-traditional modes of analysis, to students that tend to have a much more technical background? The interest is that if we can engage students early in being able to think outside the box, that when they move on into industry, they'll bring that same skill set with them. So the class that I teach is a community co-design course. It is a very unique course because it sits within the VIP structure, which gives students the ability to take the course 3 times. The course itself, in regards to the projects that we do, run 2 semesters long. So we spend the first semester doing design research, the second semester actually applying that research and trying to come up with strategies, suggestions, products, whatever form or fashion that takes, to meet a community that we are working with. And so it's definitely a space of us finding real world projects to work on and giving the students not only a chance to learn design thinking, but apply it and get that real world feedback with real world people. The course itself was inspired by our main client and one of our biggest fans and participants, Daryl Haddock, who runs West Atlanta Watershed Alliance. We were able to sort of put this project together through sort of inspecting what are sort of his goals, the desires of Wawa wanting to engage with the West Atlanta area. So what was the sort of main point of inspiration is that through Proctor Creek, which runs through 38 neighborhoods in Atlanta, connects to the Chattahoochee River, is that a lot of those neighborhoods are historically Black neighborhoods and have experienced historically environmental racism in the way of having illegal dumping. People are dumping pollutants into this creek by like tires, that could be plastic bottles. It's a number of different things that can impact the not only physical or sort of the green infrastructure that we think about in regard to nature, but also the social infrastructure. So Daryl has trash traps that have been installed on the community's behalf that they manage. And so it was looking at how can we explore not only the experiences, the values, the ways that the community defines equity, but as designers, how could we meet those with something tangible in the way of how could we upcycle these plastics to something that would not only create value for community members, but also help them engage or think about being able to subvert some of the systematic issues that are placed upon them through that.
Yeah, I think one thing that really stood out to me working with you on the VIP class was how integrated the community was to the class. It wasn't just that we were researching the community or looking at them and getting ideas and things like that, but that the community came to so many of your classes. We had community members involved and engaged throughout the entire design process. I think it's more co-design than I've seen on any other project.
Yeah, and it's very much a space that I try to be very intentional about. So going back to grad school, my focus was around social impact design and really in a space of sort of my thesis and a lot of the things that I was exploring, coming from a space of like my own identity and the idea of like what are problems that engage like my own community as a Black person and as a Black designer. What are these sort of elements that I could think about or engage with when I'm in this space as well before or to apply design. And so that brought me to a lot of different like thoughts or a lot of different design methods. And so what the elements that I really pull for this course center in equity-centered community design, which I would attribute to Creative Reaction Lab, Flock Studios, and other organizations exist when they talk about like community design. There's so many that our own professors taught us around like universal design. Just a lot of elements of like how do we engage or use design to like help people from a social context. And so a lot of my work was around how do we now centralize people that are not always centered within that process. And so a lot of that looks like being able to identify words like equity, being able to think about power dynamics. What are ways that we are able to meet the community where it is? And so one thing that I'm really big on, and a way to really simplify that, is design with instead of for. And so sort of the belief that we get to sort of prove through this course is that in the process of design, we do spend time going between tangible to abstract. But what's really important is that we confirm, like, in the ways that we will introduce this into someone's life, like what that impact would be. And so we don't necessarily think that we're disrupting human-centered design with that thought process, but it is how much more human-centered can we be in the way of like having actual humans engage with us. And so I don't have to imagine when I make something how they would respond to it if they are collaborating with us in those moments and giving us that insight. And so that's why it's so important that like when we do this work, that we have people with us so we don't have to guess. It makes it a very enriching experience because there are some things that you can possibly take data to imagine. I imagine that this person would react this way, or I could create a persona and say like, I think that they would sort of go through these behaviors. But it's way more affirming to be able to sit with someone and like hear them say whether they would or not. And so beyond that collaborative space, we also move to a space of trying to create a participatory format. And so a lot of what we try to do, or what I really try to focus on in the class, is like, as someone who like came from like engineering or industry and have seen sort of that focus of like, you did a design, but like, how are we going to introduce it into the world? It's like, how are we going to think about when we're in this class? Like, how is this going to introduce into the world? What is the impact of that going to be? How do our design decisions early on influence what we introduce? But then at that same time, how do we bring that world into that space? And so I think reaching out to you guys was an extension of that, in the way that we deal with in social impact in the work that like I take on in this class, like larger systems. And so it's like, if we want to deal with problems that exist in the real world, we have to engage with those larger systems, because it's not as simple when you do this work of bringing in real people, of just reducing things down to a persona or reducing things down to a data point. Like, these are real people that go through a lot of complex experiences and situations. And so that was a challenge that I had in my own right in studying. So I think being able to bring you guys in for the project that we just did was really important, because it was so complex and because it's a space of, you want to design for a particular experience or a particular group of people. How do you navigate all of those different experiences simultaneously? How do you find these common threads? Like, how do you think about the movement of like those needs and experiences and how they shift based on how people move through those systems, if that makes sense?
One thing that I really loved, and Shawn, you've been talking a lot about the word equity, and you even mentioned equity-centered design, which I would love to learn more about that and hear more of your description of that. But one thing that I really liked was how each semester started with, I think it was a lecture that Hanan gave on positionality, and seeing your relationship to the opportunity space that we're working in, and thinking about how your identity plays out as a designer in any work that you end up doing, and especially the importance of that when you're working with a community that's maybe not your own. For me, the community we're working with is not my community. So seeing how kind of where I sit and how I sit with my perspective in relation to the students and to community members and to the nonprofit organizations we worked with, things like that. I thought that was a really great lens to bring in.
And I think that definitely was a space, like a lot of, I think about we as designers and like how we exist or like the things that we work on is like thinking of that sort of critical lens. It's like we are very much going in to inspect other things, but like how do we also extend that to ourselves? Is how can we inspect sort of the elements that exist in the community's experience, in experiencing illegal dumping and experiencing how their neighborhood is shaped by sort of this outside force put upon them, but also like what would it look like to reshape these plastics into something that felt equitable, into something that felt like it could produce some sort of financial insight. One thing that Daryl had voiced early on, sort of long-term goal, is around the idea of being able to create a makerspace or being able to create a microeconomy through imagining those things. And so you're like, to that point, there's so many things that you think about that you would need to inspect along the way. So this class is also 2 semesters in the way that we do design research and sort of explore and apply that the second semester. And so to your point, Mariah, one thing that is extremely important around that is understanding that though we are in a way trying to connect or like understand experience, like being willing to acknowledge where that stops, because that also creates a space for inviting other collaborators. And so the understanding that as a designer, my insights are informed by my identity, like how I talked about, like a lot of what started this was me thinking about myself and like the community that I came from, what are ways that like design could meet that, being able to see ways that it can't. And so like being able to get students to understand that though a lot of the spaces we work in are close proximity to the campus, they exist within Atlanta, and they may have like gone through these experiences. Like no one within that space has lived historically in this neighborhood or had this experience. We may hear these things. So that's why it's important for us to bring in centralized groups of people that know these things, because I say all the time in my classroom, like the experts are not in here, they're in that environment. Granted, COVID produced a harder ability to go out into those spaces. But I am grateful that the community was willing to meet us because it created that opportunity for us to have that shared sort of think through those things. And it also places a certain relief because I don't have to overextend. I don't have to extend outside of my identity. I can acknowledge like what resources I can bring to the table. And because we're collectively bringing resources to the table in respective ways, it makes the process feel much more rich and rewarding, especially when you get like some sort of products that are suggested or strategies and all of those different things that result at the end of a 2-semester course like this.
So Shawn, you talked about how, this project space, there was a lot of complexity and you were really approaching it from the design thinking process. What aspects of service design did you find useful and maybe enhanced some aspects of the classwork?
And I think one thing that I walked away from was really useful that you guys brought to the course was around the idea of like ecosystem modeling. I think as I talked about, like a lot of social impact work exists in sort of examining these different lenses of systems and like to what scale that they move at. And what I really appreciated is that the service design, you guys also track how things move through those systems, or like as a service, how do things flow? Because this project is very unique in the way that one of the things that we were focused on wasn't a stagnant thing. Like trash travels through this neighborhood, and like as it does, it impacts the different people in how they exist with it. The community residents that work with us, we had Chattahoochee Riverkeeper who actually services the trash traps. And all of these elements, they overlap and they exist based on different people's interests and needs. But they all show up in different ways. And the relationships between all of those are very important to understand. Because I think in a lot of traditional academic settings, we take a frame and we just lock into that. And what we really try to do, because we're bringing in so many different viewpoints and perspectives, is that we want to see how that particular frame sits within larger frames. We want to think about within each of those frames, how is maybe the identity, the capacity, or like the value exchange maybe change, if you bring in another entity or stakeholder. One thing that I thought was really great about service design is the idea of categorizing entities. And so these might be, I thought it was a really creative way to engage the students to not only think about stakeholders, but think about entities. And so by thinking about giving characteristics to like upcycled plastics, for example, or thinking about not only Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, but what are the properties if we think about Chattahoochee River. There is a certain usefulness of being able to get students when they're in that research phase to not feel very rigid and to think about the exploration of that and how that gives them additional insight. Because I think especially in the way of like a social space, which parallels the design space, is that metaphors, analogies, the ways that we process or think about different items plays into the way that we design for them. So if I think of plastics as sort of this thing that has a quote unquote life of its own, then I think about like, what is this new life I could give to these plastics? And in the same way, how can that exchange now add new life and value to this larger ecosystem of community? One thing that in engaging with other people, wanting to bring in other people and like ecosystem mapping that you guys help activate really well is the aspect of I really wanted to engage with artists. Like who are people that could use these plastics? So being able to tap in my own network and bring in people that are artists or urban designers, that added another element to them. It's like, this is not only a new life within this community, but it gives me an inlet to be able to like help shape like this community using my own art, my own understanding of how to manipulate these things. And so I think what makes that extremely useful by you guys creating this map where we can track these things is that we can see how, again, all this bringing these resources, all this bringing these insights and ideas, what can we do with that? And like, there's some things that as a designer, I may not think about, or in the way that our client, Wawa, the way they think about plastics or the way they think about community resonance, it's completely different from the way that like an artist might define community, or an artist might think about engaging with Chattahoochee Riverkeeper and engaging with all these other stakeholders. And so when we sit down now to push the process to say, how could we come up with new ideas? How could we create new products? It's a much larger space to explore from. It's extremely important. It really just came from you guys, just being able to give us a different perspective to like map that from.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, maybe a little bit tangential, but you know, even when designing for like with this ecosystem in mind, right? You then don't jump right into designing a solution that is that is, you know, what we call a touch point, right? Like one specific touch point that somebody's interacting with, right? It could be an app, it could be whatever, but that product or exists within an ecosystem. It doesn't, or that sign that you're interacting with, you know, exists within an ecosystem, right? And so when you're going to design that, I think it gives the designer, in this case, students, the ability to kind of think about the context within which their design sits, and who are the actors that are interacting with that. Where is the value being exchanged between these actors, between different entities in the system, and what does it look like to, you know, for that sign to be where it is, right? What does it look like for the app to exist within that system, and how does it kind of play a part in that value exchange?
I did want to jump into that because it's something that was extremely important that we push the students for everyone to explore by you guys giving us this ecosystem is belief that like in the assets that are currently there. I think one thing as within design a lot of times is that we feel very married to technology. And so because of the characteristics of technology, the pace of technology, sometimes we can rush to look over certain things or certain answers that might already be there. Or the other idea within a lot of spaces of technology is that it's looking to maybe disrupt. And so like when we bring that sort of analogy, bring that sort of characteristic into a social space, it's like that can actually create some aspect of harm or disrupt an idea of equity. Because what are the technologies, what are the resources that are currently there? How do we see those as not problems or challenges, but opportunities? And so like being able, like you're saying, to look at these different nodes and and look at this overall system and say, like, what are the resources? What are the capacity of this ecosystem? And what are ways that we can source from and introduce back in? So the focus is integration and not disruption. Because again, if we're talking about equity, if I am introducing a technology that is not currently there, is that sustainable? So that's an element that we got to explore thanks to sort of using this tool. That I don't think that people would think about otherwise. And it's definitely an interesting space of like, not only what are the design decisions that I make around like what would be valuable, this being able to talk to other people or people that exist in that ecosystem gives you that definition, but then it also forces you to define like, what are these values? What is the context? What is the resources that are available? What are the elements of this experience that should be uplifted instead of necessarily shaped or shifted? And so I think it's really something that I get a lot of value in seeing myself as a teacher, because I think it does prove a usefulness or a way approach for how we can do design, not only in local communities, but how we think about doing design in corporate settings as well.
Arjun, what stood out to you most about working in this class?
I think to me, it was the level of engagement, one from the community, but also I think the students were also, what the class is not without the students, right? And I think their engagement in kind of coming from these different backgrounds, right? And we had undergrads, we had a few grad students in there, definitely like different backgrounds, not very. They didn't have a lot of design background. A lot of them didn't have a design background. So I think it was interesting to see how they brought their own perspectives and kind of engaged with the material. And I think it was special to kind of see how much that they kind of seemed to care about the topic and the subject matter. And I think one of the other things that stood out to me was some of the methods that, we brought in from a service design perspective. I think they took some of those and, we gave them an understanding that you can give within one class, right? And they took it and they, made it their own, and came back with something that surprised us, right? That maybe isn't a way that we normally would use it and was exciting. We use a technique called service origami in service design, and we use that to map out the different actors, touch points, contexts that these actors that we're trying to design for are interacting within. And so looking at what moments they're interacting within. And it's typically this model that we're co-creating among, sort of a group of 5 to 10 people. And typically this is done with these cards that you move around on the board. It's much like a game board type of situation. And the students took that and they took that idea and they turned it into something very visual. So they combined it with another technique that we use called storyboarding, which uses imagery to kind of depict what the service is going to kind of look and feel like. And they kind of mesh those two to make service origami really a much more visual tour, if you will, of what was happening in the experience. And I think it was a great way for them in their final presentations to be able to share the story of what their service was through using this imagery and this sort of combined method.
One thing that we try to do around language setting is that it's like everyone is a designer, because the idea of designing something is just your ability to influence the outcome of it. And so we invite students in just as much as they engage in the design process, or you invite community members in to like learn with us and apply and test these tools, with the understanding that they all have the stake and ability to like shift this outcome. And so like, how do we, one, understand that we all have the ability to like engage with these tools and like have something brought to us, but also bring something to it, like to add to it. We have students that are coming from engineering, public policy. We've had students come from biomedical, a lot of interesting places from campus. And so from that design standpoint, we want them to feel the confidence of like being able to express their thoughts creatively and like visualize their ideas. But then also being able, the same way that we came to grad school, how do they add something to it based on their perspectives or their elements? How would an architecture student maybe think about this? And so like, what are these common modes that we feel like everybody could gravitate to, and like how does that change the way that maybe that tool is used. But I really do, to your point, I think the element of that sort of collaborative learning, or that space of like us all realizing we're all working towards this common goal, and who are we centralizing, how do we get there? The goal is to like support this particular project or group. It's like it allows a lot of space for us to, I think, evolve tools or like shape them to meet the need. And I think in the way of design, like that's also our interest in those, that we always want to, like, we are creative in the ways that we approach problems. So how do we even think in like designing or redesigning the tools that we use to be creative with?
I would say something I felt like I learned as a facilitator or as a teacher in the course of engaging with your class was that value of, we have all these complex ideas and ways that we want to work as designers. And like for Arjun and I, we're so used to working on a team of service designers or a client team who are experts in their own domains and things like that. But when we need to really break down the concepts of design and what is the use of an ecosystem map? Why are we doing this? What do we want to get out of it? Not just like, in addition to what elements are included in it. And just that experience of trying to keep those things as clear and simple as possible. And I like another word that you used was guiding that thought process. So we do try to have like a little bit of teaching and then getting people right into that hands-on experience of using this tool and how they can get value out of it. The first time we started doing ecosystem mapping with a group, we felt like we could just sort of explain what it was and then let them go for it, which they did, with all the bravery of design students. But one thing that we realized was that having a little bit more facilitation and guidance throughout that first kind of approach to a tool was something that kind of helped, I think, everybody get more value out of using it. So I thought that was a really good example of how we iterate, even in our process and facilitation and things like that. So it was a cool opportunity to be able to do that and learn some lessons too.
I was just going to add to that and say, like, on a similar note, one of my takeaways from teaching the class, right? One of the things, Shawn, that you said, I think when we were in a planning session and, we had like, we're going to cover this thing and this thing and this thing. And you were like, keep to like one concept, keep it simple. Yeah. And I think that's something I can take with me back to my practice, right? And the way that I'm working with clients, kind of breaking down new concepts. Often we're finding ourselves kind of, coaching, teaching, like I said, right? Our clients in the work that we do and the type of work that we do, and trying to build that within the organization. And it can be a lot to like break all of this down, even if you've been in the industry for a long time. This is a lot of this can be new stuff for you. And I think that concept of, take it one thing at a time is something that I definitely take back from that.
I was going to say one thing that, to both of you all's points, I definitely think, I would never say this in class, or students, if you're listening, would say this. But I think, honestly, they keep me sharp. Like, we left grad school with an understanding of, like, what do these practices look like in theory? And so I get the opportunity to kind of straddle that fence and really get to apply them in real life. And so one thing I think about, because my background in my past life before I came to grad school was, like, I was doing design engineering in, like, an aerospace flight system. So it's like, think of, like, a rocket, for example. Like, the scaffolding they put on a rocket to get it out of orbit is much different than like what returns like back to Earth. It's like a pot. It is so much smaller than that. But it doesn't mean that the experience wasn't valuable, and they come back with a rich level of understanding. And so for us, I think when we think of that aspect of abstraction, it's like, what is all this scaffolding that we'll build so that we can sort of like launch people to think outside of that box? And we want to guide them because we don't want them to get lost in space. They got to come back with that information, but understanding that it's like at the end of the day, they're not going to bring that entire rocket back unless maybe they're working at SpaceX. But to this point, in this analogy's sake, they're going to come back. We got to make sure we bring them back. Like that's the thing. If we lose all the other stuff in orbit, it was worth it. We want to make sure that they land back on ground. And I think what is the test of that and the test of our work as designers is that we get to test it in real life and see like, what are these things? Because that helps you figure out like, what are the pieces that I can let go of? Like, this is a way that helps me think, but maybe I could shift this because the idea is that it's like this needs to exist in real life. And like, that's the thing that we're still striving for in this class. Obviously, there are certain constraints in the ways that we can't, but I like the fact that we're at least able to, as close as we can, simulate or like explore with like real life people to think about how that would go and exist within real life. And so my hope is same thing with the clients, same things with the idea of like people you work with. I want the students, I want you guys, I want anyone who's in this course. It's like we are going to, in a very designer way, and we're going to start in reality, but we're going to go off and we're going to explore all these different elements. We're going to inspect them and see what we can sort of abstract out and understand. See these like granular sort of values or these opportunities that exist. But it's important that we really do at some point start to think about like, what would this exist as? What would this live as? And then sometimes you realize to make sure that it can like take root, to make sure that it can grow. But maybe I do have to remove some of the scaffolding because I really want to make sure that this like takes root. And so you let the community decide that. And so if the community is in a space of, this is what we want this to look like, this is what we're really looking for, then it kind of gives you an insight. So that's why one thing in Mariah's point around having the community continue to come in is that it takes, it gives you guidance. It gives you guidance all along the process. And so using that same space analogy, they might be mission control, where it's like, hey, you guys are up there in orbit and you're thinking about a lot of different things. Don't forget, like you got to come back to Earth. And so know that these are the things that you can bring with you. You can't bring all those space watts. Like we sent you up there for like a couple things. Make sure you bring them back. And so to that point, that's why it's so exciting as well to see like, it challenges us to say like, what is our focus? And like, especially as a course that is attempting to be community facing, it's like, what are even these elements of academia? What are these things that like they exist within this space of like academia they're used for? Even how we think about design within a corporate area or vice versa. It's like, they're all useful and important for that context, but in regard to this community, what are these things that they need most? How do I prioritize those? And then how do I let them navigate like which ones that I continue to focus on and where I place my focus? So that way, like we meet them exactly where they are at the end of the day.
So one thing that keeps kind of coming up a lot is how complex this ecosystem that we were working within was. Even with this class, we had nonprofit organizations, multiple nonprofit organizations. We had community members, we had artists, you had other design firms. So that is a lot to coordinate. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like as as a professor, as a teacher of this class? You're pulling this all together. What was that like?
I would say one thing that helps keep me grounded is thinking about not that this is simply a classroom, but I'm a designer. And so like, what is my product? And so like, who is my product for? And thinking about it in a very human-centered design way, like who are my stakeholders? Who do I want to engage with? And so it starts really early on with being able to like, think of like, what is this opportunity space? And also having a curriculum or knowing, for example, that it's like we want to teach students design thinking does give some skeleton to work from. So like, I know that it's like, I want to teach empathy, or I want to teach define, or I want to teach these research methods around like how to get students, community members, nonprofits, whoever's going to be in the room. I want them to like ideate. And so it's like, I think that gives me some sort of two things that I get to start with. I get to start with what is the goal or aspiration of the like client that we're going to work with, and then like what are the ways that like you can explore that using like design thinking. But it is complex, and so I think in that aspect there's a lot of outside of design pedagogy, there's an aspect of design strategy, because all of these things need to flow together. One thing that you guys are aware of is people that like came to teach is that there's an element of not just presenting information, but designing information so that it's easily consumable. A lot of times our classes run at most, if I can stretch it, to 50 minutes. And so that is a very short amount of time when you want to teach a complex design concept. But it also creates a challenging creative opportunity to say, again, like, what is the way that I can present this to someone, give them space to sort of learn and practice with it? And then what are ways that they get to apply it? And so you're doing a lot of things at one time. But to that point, like, as service designers, I'm sure you are fully aware of it. It's like the ability to have a service that can operate and hit several touch points or engage multiple stakeholders is a good service. And so I cannot call myself a service designer. You guys are heads and tails above me. But I do think about that as a product. And I think about what are the things that we need to operationalize and how do we get from point A to point B, not only teaching these tools, but also using them in real time. So you guys saw behind the scenes of what that looks like for us to lay out a roadmap and maybe iterate that roadmap, or to think of like, how are we going to teach this lesson plan? And like, how are we going to think about the students? Who are these people that are going to be engaging? What are the things that they would need to know? Who would we pair together collaboratively to explore this? Or getting the students to a point where they can visualize their service origami so that we can sit down and like bring people in to give feedback about how a service would operate. Part of it is leaning on our design knowledge, but also part of it is leaning and believing in the students in regard to nonprofits, all these people that are really subject matter experts to fill the space that we create as designers.
There were times when we were working through the lesson plan kind of roadmap that you had put together, right? And we were sitting and kind of talking about it. And at some points, the type of information that we were putting in there and the, like, looking at all these different, are actors in this system, right? Of the class, kind of looking meta at the class itself. There's all these different actors that we're trying to coordinate. There's like what's happening on the day of. It looked a lot like a service blueprint that we would create to look at, coordinate what are the different actors doing, what are the touch points. In this case, maybe that was the class, like what's the lesson plan, things like that. But it was interesting sort of to think back as you were explaining this, like the roadmap that you had created looked a lot like, a blueprint would look like. And it actually helped us, right, as a tool to talk through what we needed to have ready by when. Much like you would in a blueprint, where you're looking at, what do we need to do on the behind the scenes, backstage, to be able to have ready for, maybe a class that was 2 weeks out. And that gave us an ability to look at that and say, oh, that's very soon, right? If we're doing this thing here and students only have 2 weeks to do that, that might not be enough time, and be able to like use this sort of visual tool to be able to shift things around. I thought was an interesting, part of our collaboration behind the scenes also.
I definitely think of when I try to explain design, especially because I'm explaining it to people that exist outside of it, if I boil it all down to like one of its most useful capacities is that I am translating something abstract to something tangible. So there are these abstract, complex ideas that we work with. Like in our course, it's like you could say that could be environmental racism in regard to like these things that are illegally dumped into this community, or the idea of like, how do we think about a microeconomy? Like all these like things that if you say those words, it's like, what does that mean? I imagine a lot of different things, but I don't know what particular. And then as you work through the class, like for example, we get to strategies that we can get back to Wawa to implement that are much more tangible in that way, and they address those abstract concepts. I think in the aspect of teaching is very much the same thing. And so I appreciate that you guys are even willing to stick with me when I approached you with this idea, because it is very abstract. We sat down on like how we were going to do this. And so to your point, it's a lot of thinking about what you want other people to think about, and like thinking of how you'll guide them through that thought process. And so it's definitely it's an interesting space to work within for sure. I think about the aspect of doing design pedagogy, I feel like the teaching aspect is, again, that's the front stage, but it is so many things going on beyond the backstage that have to go right, or they don't even necessarily go right because it's an iterative process and designers, we have to stay on their toes. But you think about like, this is, not only is this the larger product, but this is the product that I need to like put out every day. Maybe it's pretty rough and it gets iterated within the moment. And maybe that product informs like the product of the class that I teach next. Is definitely a space of exploration. It's definitely a space of iteration. So the class that you guys worked with was us iterating from the course we did the year before. And hopefully you guys will be with us when we do the next one. Will be just sharper, just smoother, and way more innovative. I'm excited to see what it'll turn into on this next project as well.
Yeah, I think we're ready to iterate too. I think that's a good word. I would say something I felt like I learned as a facilitator or as a teacher in the course of engaging with your class was that value of, we have all these complex ideas and ways that we want to work as designers. And like for Arjun and I, we're so used to working on a team of service designers or a client team who are experts in their own domains and things like that. But when we need to really break down the concepts of design and what is the use of an ecosystem map, why are we doing this, what do we want to get out of it, not just like, in addition to what elements are included in it. And just that experience of trying to keep those things as clear and simple as possible. And I like another word that you used was guiding that thought process. So we do try to have like a little bit of teaching and then getting people right into that hands-on experience of using this tool and how they can get value out of it. The first time we started doing ecosystem mapping with a group, we felt like we could just sort of explain what it was and then let them go for it, which they did, with all the bravery of design students. But one thing that we realized was that having a little bit more facilitation and guidance throughout that first kind of approach to a tool was something that kind of helped, I think, everybody get more value out of using it. So I thought that was a really good example of how we iterate, even in our process and facilitation and things like that. So it was a cool opportunity to be able to do that and learn some lessons too. What do you think that Wawa took away from this class?
I want to make sure I shout out Daryl Haddock in name specifically, because Daryl and I had talked about this class probably, I'd say arguably, if not a year at least. I knew about this. I started working here, like teaching and sort of within Design Bloc in 2019 when I graduated. And I had known about Daryl's project, but we didn't really get the ball rolling until maybe a year after. So we would sit and talk and sort of think about, like, what does this look like? Because to Arjun's point, you're working with a client, and part of not only what will we do, it's understanding what design does. And so what are these opportunities for us to be able to work together? Where do those things exist and lie? And so it really came to a space around, like, I have these trash traps. And like what I envision we can do with these trash traps is like much larger than that, in the way of that I could see these as an opportunity for us to bring value back into the space. Because as it sat, they pulled the trash out of the trash traps and they sort of sit, they collect them and they may inspect them and do other means. But there's really this thought of like, how do we integrate this back into the community? How do we support a area that is often like under engaged and under serviced by like the larger population? So like that was really his vision or mission. It's like, how could we start making steps to create a makerspace? Or how could we start thinking about even the aspect of being able to employ people that would not only pull the trash out of the trash traps, but now process it into pellets if they want to sell it to people who want to buy that and then turn it into another product. And so him having that spark in that space is really what gave the opportunity to imagine like how we could fill that with design. And so that was important, is that like beyond a product, it was what is the strategy of like what is the current space? And like it sort of laid out where you would imagine it could go. And so like what are those sort of connecting points? Like what is the like elements that would be needed, the resources within this space to sort of imagine where we could go with this. And so I think beyond the aspect of like, at the end of the semester, students were able to give these strategies of not only how we upcycle these plastics, but how did the community's needs, the things that we worked with and they told us in the first semester, how does it connect back to that? How do we connect all of this story together? And so we were able to give him those strategies. But the other thing that I really, that helps me remember like this is important work and beyond sort of the idea of the output of the product, it's the experience and like who we're able to engage with and teach, was the understanding that like Daryl now sees the ability for him to visualize like what it is that he feels like this community could use over. And so that was not only a space of things that he has expressed, but even in the aspect of us reaching out to like people that participated with us in the community. There's another thing that they sort of echo is like, how am I now able to use design as a way to visualize, to advocate, and like establish an idea of like, what could this look like? Like we see in our day-to-day illegal dumping, we see the creek with like pollutants in it. And now we're able to see something else that we could try to work to. So I think that was extremely important, something that I'm excited that you took away from that.
Yeah, we were losing the light on your end.
Yeah, that was cool. It's like about to start raining here, and I just watch as I fade into black.
Yeah, it's like, this is dramatic. Is this like the ending? Like the
that might be the way you cut that to the ending. Yeah. We just put the black together because I was like, what is going on?
That was very dramatic. So Shawn, tell me, what's next for this project?
So in regard to the academic perspective, we have ended this project and we'll transition to a new one. However, one thing that we really focus on in Design Bloc is building relationships. So the idea is that relationships should continue. We're talking with Daryl. We're also in conversations with you guys around how could we bring these to reality in the way that we talked about this? What would it take for us to be able to realize this? And so we're all very excited to see what that will look like and what this will turn into, not only through Wawa, but for the sake and support of the West Atlantic community.
Yeah, this class it's been great for us to be involved, and we appreciate you reaching out a couple of semesters ago and getting the opportunity to work with you and Design Bloc and all of your staff. So and of course the community and the students, right? It's been great, and we're excited to stay connected, keep that relationship going, and keep working on these kinds of projects. I think these kinds of projects are so important, and not something that even in industry, not something you get to work on every day, right? So it's just very, very meaningful in that way. So
yeah, we definitely enjoy the fact that you guys have engaged with us. In the spirit of it takes a village, we're always looking for collaborators to engage with us and see how we can not only go together, but better by bringing in all these different insights. And so not just you guys, anyone listening, people wanting to explore how they can not only engage with these sort of non-traditional classes or think about how they could apply design in a different context. Our doors always open on campus to continue this sort of conversation, not only in us talking, but in the ways that we use design to communicate.
Awesome, cool. And I'll add to that, Harmonic Design really loves engaging with universities and schools and teaching design, as well as working with not-for-profit clients and things like that as well on projects with this kind of complexity. We really believe in the power of service design to address complex problems like this. So it's something that we've really enjoyed working with you and are excited to kind of continue that partnership and have another year, hopefully. So thanks again.
Cool.
Yeah, awesome. Cool.
Always good to work with your friends.
Definitely that too. Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you guys for taking the time today for this conversation, and it's been really enlightening and a good conversation.
No problem. I'll take care.
Yeah.
All right. You too. Bye.
Thanks. Yeah. Bye.